With India now suffering as it is, with record numbers of people now being diagnosed on a daily basis with COVID-19, fears are that deaths attributable to the pandemic could in fact be running at double the government numbers. Headlines show the deep levels of suffering the people of the subcontinent are having to endure. While we continue to think about the individuals, the families, the social groups and the larger communities at risk as the pandemic spreads across India, in this Trading the Markets podcast, we're here to look at the market's response. And I'll ask all the important questions, and the big one about whether markets are mispricing the global risk. Welcome to this edition of the IG Trading the Markets podcast. I'm Jeremy Naylor. We're returning now to a guest we had the pleasure to speak to back in February this year, Dr Navid Malik, Head of Life Sciences Research at the Life Sciences Division. Dr Malik is a medically trained doctor, but who has also built major healthcare franchises for leading UK brokers and investment banks, raising over £2 billion for the sector. He's an acknowledged expert in COVID-19 and how it relates to the markets. And answering the question, have markets got it wrong? And should we be more aware of the long-tail risks that the virus will cause? Dr. Malik, it's a pleasure to have you back on with us on this podcast. When we spoke in February, there were high hopes that a corner had been turned, but nonetheless, you did warn then that there were a number of underlying risks that were yet to make themselves felt. I want to get into the question of the possible mispricing of risk later on in the interview, but first, I'd like to start by asking you what's happened since we last spoke in February, because clearly here in the UK, we are in a very much better position than we were then, but some regions are, as we've just seen, in a very dark place. So let's start with the question, how would you appraise the situation now as we look into the months of May?
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to speak with you again. As we move into May, I believe we're entering a critical period where we need to escalate the rates and global levels of vaccination, particularly in the hotspots around the world where the virus is re-emerging. We need to do this whilst maintaining a closer eye on what are now a number of variants of the virus that are circulating, each with different distinguishing features. This could present a problem to all of us on an ongoing basis. So most certainly, even as we exit more lockdowns around the world and here in the UK, it's extremely important to maintain social distancing and behave as if we are still in a pandemic, which we are. One thing I mentioned previously back in February was that the virus is very adept at exploiting vulnerabilities. Initially, it seeks out hosts that have an underlying health condition and infects them and causes them to be hospitalized and sadly, in many cases, die. However, as the vaccination rates have increased, the virus has evolved and it's increased in infectiousness post-vaccination, particularly where the elderly and more vulnerable parts of our population have become protected. The virus has been able to move down into the more healthy population and increases infectious nature in that population as well. So people in various parts of the world where we haven't had full vaccinations occur, who are young and healthy, are starting to succumb to the virus. And if you observe what's happening in Brazil, for example, you can see this playing out, where essentially healthy individuals who are in their 30s, 40s and 50s are not only succumbing to the disease, but sadly dying from it. So as we move into May, I think we need to be very cautious how we move forward and keep a close eye on infection levels and transmission rates between countries.
You mentioned Brazil, but what's gone so wrong in India?
Well, India has been a surprise to all of us. I mean, when we wrote our research note back in February and published it on the 1st of Feb, we did a lot of analysis in the problem areas around the world and focused predominantly on South America and Brazil in particular. But back in February, if you looked at India, there were probably around 10,000 infections every day, and the number of deaths was as low as 100. What's transpired since then is that there have been a number of circulating variants, different versions of COVID-19 as a virus circulating in India. And suddenly out of nowhere, around the middle of February, started seeing the number of cases rise. And yesterday, to put it in perspective, there was 363,000 reported daily infections and 3,285 deaths. And this transformation has occurred in about 8 weeks. So what concerns me about India is that back in February, they were talking about the fact that the country had reached potential herd immunity because in major cities, a large numbers of the population had been infected with the older versions of the virus and recovered. But this troubling change that's occurred in India has principally been driven through the virus mutating. And as it has mutated, and the fact that even if hundreds of millions of people have been infected in India, because I don't think we can really rely on existing numbers in talking to 18 million being diagnosed and infected, it's got to be hundreds of millions. It's underreported by for sure. We're going to see that there will be a number of individuals who will still spread the virus. And we're going to end up in a situation where the infection rates and deaths are going to continue to rise. So this new variant with these two mutations, which I'll come to a little bit later, are really reaching an inflection point in India. And I think what we've got to do is we've got to get to a situation where they can control the virus, because the more individuals who are infected in India, particularly with this new mutant version of the virus, the more chances are that it will continue to mutate and the death rate and infections will continue to rise. So from an Indian perspective, I think they've just been extremely unlucky that this variant that they've ended up having evolve has a particularly troubling mutations that basically are going to cause issues with regards to increased infection and potentially resistance or reduction in the ability for your immune system to show a combined benefit in eradicating the virus once you're infected.
So how do these mutations or variants come about? Is it the viral response to finding a way around an efficient vaccination? Is it the virus working as it possibly should do? Or do mutations occur when the virus is left to run rampant? But I'm thinking about here in the West, UK particularly, where we have a very high rate of vaccination. And so far, we've been able to control mutations or variants. But obviously in India, despite the fact that, as what you just said, is the fact that they are closer than most nations to some sort of herd immunity, but nonetheless, vaccinations isn't as well spread. So what is it that brings about these mutations or variants?
You know, I think, Jeremy, that the challenge is, and this is something I think we alluded to previously, the challenge is that unless you ramp up the pace of vaccinations and you vaccinate everyone literally at the same time, and you do it as quickly as possible, what happens is you end up with pockets of individuals who are vaccinated and therefore protected from the virus, and pockets of individuals who are unvaccinated and therefore not protected. And in the midst of that sea, you've got the virus continuing to change in both those populations. So there is evidence that some of the mutations that we've seen evolve, particularly with the Indian double mutant version and the Brazilian version, obviously, as well. There's evidence that the antibodies our bodies produce, either from a vaccination or from recovery post-infection, have a diminished positive result. They are reduced in their ability to neutralize the virus successfully. They still work, but there's a reduction in the efficacy of those vaccines through the antibodies that we produce. And then the other issue is that, I think we've always believed that the first true wave of the virus, as it goes through the population, will always encumber mutations. There'll always be mutations that occur, and the virus will change. As you vaccinate the population, you reduce the risk of infection and spread. So the ability of the virus to continue to mutate is that much harder. However, if it does mutate, and it mutates in countries where there's a mixture of vaccinated and non-vaccinated individuals, then you end up with this horrible situation where the virus may figure out a way of getting past the immune system, even from those who've been vaccinated. And if you can get past the immune system, then you're in a situation where you could have variants emerge, which could potentially bring us back to, sort of ground zero. And I'm not saying or suggesting in any way that we're going to see anything like the infection rates that we're seeing today in Brazil and India recur around the world as we vaccinate the population. But the risks are that the virus will squeeze past, so to speak, our immune system as it learns to evolve and as it evades the immune system more and more adeptly. And when that happens, we're going to face a situation where we're going to have to revaccinate people.
Mm. As I referenced at the top, the UK is seemingly doing well, although we mustn't lose sight of the fact that somewhere approaching 130,000 people have sadly lost their lives here in the UK to COVID. Chile has had a similar success story to the UK on vaccines, but it's still experiencing a difficult time. How do you align those two different, seemingly parallel stories in some aspects, but diverging sort of experience in others?
This is a really interesting comparison between Chile and the UK. This is something that we picked up on weeks ago again. We were interested to see the fact that if you looked at the numbers of individuals who received the first dose in both the UK and Chile, that broadly the numbers were similar. About 50% of the population had been given the vaccine in first dose terms across those two geographies. But the difference is, whilst we've been very good at maintaining security of our borders and clamping down through very good testing, surge testing, for example, on new variants that arrive into the country. And so we've been able to suppress them. Unfortunately, Brazil and the uncontrolled spread of the virus in Brazil has seeped over the borders into various countries, including Chile and Argentina, for example. And Chile is interesting because they have, as I said, had a high level of success with vaccination. But what they have got, which we don't have here, is the emergence and high circulating levels of the Brazilian variant called the P1 variant as an acronym. And that Brazilian variant has been shown to increase the level of transmission from person to person and has the potential also to have a reduced effectiveness from antibodies, including those generated from antibodies. So basically what's happening is that in Chile, despite the fact that the population, a large part of it's been vaccinated, the strength of this variant, the P1 Brazilian variant, has been robust enough to still burn through the population. And what we've heard from places like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil is that healthy individuals, relatively young, with no underlying health condition, have been hospitalized and in many cases have succumbed to disease and died simply because they've been infected with the Brazilian variant. Even if those individuals have previously been infected, they're getting reinfected. So for us, I think when we look at Chile and the success of the vaccine rollout, we have to be mindful that the vaccine success will only last as long as the ability of the virus to be suppressed. If the virus figures out a way to get around the vaccination process and the ability to generate efficacious antibodies, then it may start to come back. And I think it's a lesson for all of us to pay close attention to places like Chile to see what happens as we go through the coming months and make sure that we deal with any issues quickly. But unfortunately in Chile, they probably don't have the same level of social distancing, surge testing, genomic sequencing that we have in the UK. So they're a little bit flying blind, which is a sad thing to say, but I think the reality there.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, as you say, along with a land border with an area that is finding the going tough in Brazil.
Absolutely.
So having a water border does actually help in this situation.
Absolutely.
Let me begin to steer the conversation towards the markets, which, as I said at the top, is really what we're here to discuss, whilst mindful, as I say, of the tragedy and the personal tragedy this virus is causing. Do we know any more about the time horizon for the virus, or is it still too early to understand where this will go? I'm thinking about a headline I saw at the weekend talking about Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, one of the wealthiest people in the world. He said then, or reports suggested, he said that he's hopeful that the world will be completely back to normal by the end of 2022. Is that overambitious, do you think? Do we know enough to give a projection like that?
I think that I was surprised as well when I realized he'd said that. It's really difficult to predict. The problem we've got is, I don't know if you realize, Jeremy, but we just hit a big milestone in terms of the number of vaccine doses that have been administered. We hit 1 billion doses a few days ago. So around the world, 1 billion doses have now been distributed and administered into people. Yeah. The problem is we've got 7 billion in the world as global population. So how do you kind of correlate a timeline to get back to normal if you don't know the timeline of vaccination? And until we vaccinate literally every adult in the world, And we may have to go into younger populations such as teenagers and children as well, because they'll still be able to spread the virus as well. Until we get to that point, it's going to be really difficult to put a timeline on when we get back to a new normal, for argument's sake. I mean, our belief is that we're working on the assumption this is going to drag on for a few more years. Now, it won't have the same severity, but it will still be a problem. It will still cause us angst. It will still cause flare-ups in different parts of the world that will be a cause for concern. So coming back to what we've always said is we need to live alongside this virus. And, certainly coming back to your point about what Bill Gates has said, I think it's extremely important that we keep up the work on developing new generations of vaccines, not add-ons or boosters, but we need to go back to the drawing board while we have time. We need to start again with vaccine development and develop completely new approaches that can work against a multitude of variants, not just one. Because my concern is that, we're going to end up with 3 or 4 different versions of a vaccine, and we'll be trying to figure out who to give it to depending on the variants that's circulating in the country at the time. We also need to, more importantly, escalate our efforts quite significantly in the development of therapeutics, which in my view, sadly, has lagged significantly behind the successes that we've seen with vaccines. We basically need better therapeutics in the hospital setting to get patients out of ICU or prevent them from going into ICU and get them back to health. Or we need to develop therapeutics, which is probably more of an issue, as we talked about in February, for long COVID. The road to recovery in those patients is very long and unclear, and we don't have enough data yet to know what the long-term clinical situations will look like. However, we need to be prepared to have a new range of drugs to deal with it. I mean, there are going to be people who've recovered from COVID who basically have got long-term issues around kidney health because the kidney gets ravaged by COVID-19. They'll have fibrosis in the lung because they won't see full lung recovery. If the lung is damaged at the ends of the lung, the alveoli, and become fibrotic, you lose that function. So I think we can get back to normal as long as we can, in parallel, develop the next versions of the vaccines and therapies. If we don't, we're going to end up in a situation where we will, sometime in the future, have to deal with this all over again. So we've got to keep running.
Yeah, well, of course, one of the interesting things about this is that we live in mostly a capitalist environment, and money flows through into areas where it's most needed. And thankfully, the pharmaceutical, biotech, life sciences sector has responded. And in this competitive environment, of course, they all want to be the first to come up with the new way in which is going to help us combat COVID. Since in the last, 8-10 weeks we've spoken, how has the pharmaceutical, biotech, or life sciences sector responded to what's been happening in terms of development of the virus?
Well, I actually have been really encouraged by the way that the pharma and biotech sector has responded. It's been interesting to see how nimble and innovative the sector has been. A large number of companies, both in the US and in the UK, for example, have continued to develop the next generation vaccines and therapeutics. So, for example, we've seen clinical data emerge from some companies in the States where they've tried to look at whether targeting different parts of the virus would lead to better vaccine strategies. We've continued to see here in the UK, companies start both UK and US trials on better therapeutics to potentially save people from harm of being in ICU and succumbing to the disease. So the sector itself has actually not moved away from the pandemic. The sector has stayed in the pandemic realms and has continued to fight the battle. And the financing aside, which has been obviously terrific for the small end of the market, we've seen a very good response from the sector, which suggests to me that the biotech and pharma companies are going to continue to develop therapeutics and vaccines along the way.
Let's move back into the market meat here, if we can, if that's the right way to put it. And ask that question I put at the top is whether you think the markets are mispricing the risk. We've done a lot of seminars recently on the amount of money that's going into the equity markets, for example, record highs for Wall Street, record highs recently for the DAX. We got market impetus on the way up in France, and the Western market's really riding on the money that's around in the markets at the moment, seemingly for no real reason. But I'm worried that there is an overextension at the top end here. People are being too enthusiastic to take on risk. with this threat that's hanging over us from COVID, do you think that the markets are mispricing the downside potential from COVID?
I actually believe the markets are, as you've said, Jeremy, I think they've been looking beyond the pandemic and pricing in the recovery. And this pretty much started when we had a successful readout of the first of the phase 3 clinical trials from the major vaccine players, and we started to emerge from the lockdowns. However, I don't think we're clearly out of the woods yet. I think that a number of countries are achieving high vaccination rates, and we have to consider the possibilities that there'll be continued infections that will normalize to low levels, but there will still be a risk of the virus coming back and the levels of infections rising, particularly as we start to see social distancing, fall away, and we start to see the virus evolve and develop more mutations. So I think we've got to really focus on the fact that, yes, we are vaccinating a large part of the population, but there is a risk that the sector rotation that we've seen out of defensive areas such as pharma and food into more COVID-ravaged stocks is perhaps a little bit too early in terms of the timing. And we're not out of the woods yet. We still have a long way to go. And I think that we're probably going to see a lot more volatility return towards the end of this year as we see the levels of infections, which they will almost certainly start to rise again in different parts of the world.
But before we get too many people writing in saying, why didn't I ask about individual stocks? I just want to say that we can't talk about individual stocks themselves. But one final question, Navid, I think we really do have to address is, as a sector, where are the opportunities as you see them?
Again, great question. So we think there are strong opportunities to invest in our sector right now. Ordinarily, when you're looking at the pharmaceutical sector, which has done very well through the lockdown and through the emergence of the vaccine strategies that various pharma companies have developed, you would ordinarily see sector rotation. So you'd see more capital outflow from the pharma sector back into the banking sector, for example, travel and leisure. People will be looking forward, thinking that the recovery is coming, and they'll be investing in that way. However, we believe strongly that the pharma sector has probably been oversold. We think there's been a heavy reliance on looking at the pharma sector in terms of just COVID. And yet, if you look at the success of a multitude of phase 3 clinical trials from various pharma companies, it does suggest that pharma companies are still very good at developing new drugs as new sources of income. From the perspective of biotechnology companies, we think that despite the fact that people have added to risk, they've leveraged beta, and they've started to look for alpha and absolute returns, biotech companies have performed extremely well. You look back at the beginning of 2020 when everyone was getting marked down, the biotech companies started to reposition themselves in the COVID world, started to do well, raised money, generated clinical data. And there's been a redefining, I think, of the biotech sector to the extent where biotech today is no longer seen as kind of the high risk, obscure end of the market. There are biotech companies in the UK and Europe sector, for example, which have highly attractive valuations, as in they're discounted significantly compared to the US peer group. And yet a number of them have successfully circumvented clinical trials, even phase 3 trials, and read out successfully. And yet they're still trading on a discount. So from the sector perspective, we would see opportunities to invest both in the pharmaceutical space and also the biotechnology space. I mean, essentially, the pharma space gives you your blue chip, your dividend income, your defensiveness, which I think you still should have in your portfolio. But from the perspective of biotech, if you're looking for those returns, the biotech sector is now very firmly placed to generate them. And I made the analogy before, but I see the biotech sector is continuing to have bull market feel, much like the tech sector has enjoyed for probably the last 20 years.
Okay, look, Navid, we'll have to leave it there, but it's been a pleasure. Thanks indeed for your time steering us through this latest update from the world of coronavirus and how it relates to the market. That's Dr. Navid Malik. He's Head of Life Sciences Research at the Life Sciences Division. You can catch up with him on his website. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGCom and subscribe to our YouTube channel.